Ready? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Happy Sabbath. This morning we are coming back to get our lesson study started. Before we start, let's have a word of prayer. Our dear God and Father, we want to thank Thee for this Sabbath day. We want to thank Thee for the truths that we have learned throughout the week. We want to ask Thee that as You help us to focus on rest this week, that we might have another restful Sabbath day with Thee. We're asking Thee to send Thy Holy Spirit to interpret the words to our hearts. Help us that we might learn truths old and new, and may we apply these truths to our hearts. We're asking Thee to continue to work with us and help us that we too might spread Thy word as our prayer through Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. So, come unto me is the topic of this week's lesson. Come unto me. And the main focus for the week is Matthew 11, 28 through 30. We'll read that before we get started. That's Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. I'm going to read it in your hearing, and we will deal with the phrases that were expounded in the lesson this week. It says, Jesus speaking says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. All of you, take up your yoke and learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I know most of us read it in the King James Version, which sounds a little bit different from the way how I read it. The lesson starts with Jesus saying, "Come unto me." You know, that's the great invitation, and we've learned this throughout the years. I mean, from very kids, we've heard it. You know, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The question asks in Sabbath afternoon, what can we experience? How can we experience the rest that Jesus is talking about? You know, that's the theme for the week's lesson. Then it goes on to say that all of us are, labor every day, and we're heavy laden. Not only because of physical labor, but because of mental labor. Also might be spiritual labor that we are under. And we know that that came down from Adam after Adam sinned, that God said, "What? By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread." So we all carry burdens which are very heavy. The teacher's lesson gave an illustration that was kind of really poignant. What it talked about this is a story of an old farmer who was toiling all day, and he collected his produce. He has the sack of his produce on his back, and he's walking. He's sweating and stuff like that, trying to make it home, and he's looking around to see if, somebody can help him or one of his neighbors can help him. A neighbor but a neighbor happens to be passing with a horse-drawn carriage and say, "Jump on the back here and I'll take you to wherever you're going." The farmer jumps on the back of the farmer gets on the back of the carriage, and they're going along. And the driver of the carriage looks back, and he sees is the farmer is sitting on the carriage with the sack of potatoes with the sack of his produce on his back. And he's like, "Why are you, we've got sufficient room here. Why are you taking them?" And the farmer said, "You've done sufficient for me. I could, you give me a ride. The least I could do is keep my potatoes on my back, That gives the illustration of what we do when Jesus says, "Come on to me, and I will take your burdens from you. Bring your burdens bring your burdens to me, and I will take them. But what we do is, like the farmer, we bring our burdens and we say, "I'll give you it," but we still hold on. We still hold on to it and be burdened by it. What the lesson goes on to say is, when Jesus bids us come unto him, it talks more about free will. It's like this is an invitation. You have to what? You have to say, I need you, right? It isn't. He doesn't force us. He just says, come to me, and what you have to do is to know that you need him, right? Not so much that he's not saying, hey, get over here and I will do this for you. He says, come, freely come. Yes, ma'am?
I was reading this, Jesus, he used illustrations to fit the people that he was talking to, and they was like agriculture, where they did farm work. So we see that an ox carries this yoke, but the person behind it, is the ox is carrying most of the load, but you're behind it in a relationship with it.
Right.
In order to get the work done. And
right.
So that's mainly is what Jesus is saying. His invitation is to come, because he's not going to force his way up. That word come is an invitation to them to come to him. And then he would relieve them of their burden.
Right.
It was also an understanding that you had to realize that you needed a Savior.
Right.
And when you came to that conclusion, it was a surrenderance.
Right.
Component to that.
Right.
To, like you said, to release the burden of the potatoes.
Yeah.
Realizing that this guy drove by to help you.
Right.
That you did not have to carry it alone.
Right. The lesson goes on to say, surrendering to Christ is like the hardest thing that people can do. It's the toughest part of the Christian life, to submit your will to Christ's will. A lot of us find that, not a lot of us, but a lot of people, the message goes out, and it's like when there's time asking for surrender, most people are like, hey, this goes contrary to what I believe or what I want to do. I think I got a little bit ahead of myself here, but getting back to the beginning of the lesson on Sunday, they asked, what was the context in which Jesus started with "Come unto me"? What was happening before he started saying, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest"? Anybody remember in Matthew 11 verses 20 through 28? Anybody remember what was going on?
I remember them trying to see if which one was better than the other, which one was not there to sit with him. King, it might be another part, but he just he went to him and asked him to come to him. He saw them suffering and going through a lot of changes, so he wanted them to surrender themselves to him so he could be able to carry that heavy load that they had.
Anybody else? What was the main theme? What Jesus was telling them is, I've done a lot of miracles in all these other places, right? Not all these other places. I've done a lot of miracles in this place, and most of you guys didn't believe me, or you didn't really accept me, right? You didn't repent. So here he is saying, that's why he started saying, "Come unto me, all you who labor," right? "And are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." It says in the lesson, it says that when he started talking about the places that did not accept him, he made some really condemning words, which, and at times he compared them to Sodom and said, Sodom is going to do a lot better than you when it comes time for the judgment, that was words I'm sure that those people did not want to hear, because Sodom was a place that was known for wickedness. And most of those people felt like they were good, they didn't have any problems. And it says, after he told them all that, then he kind of changed gears and say, come unto me, right? And you can find rest. Like we said here, he said the coming is not optional, right? It represents a precondition of you finding God. You have to come to him. You got a statement there?
I was just, from the study, he was addressing sin and the state of the people at that time, and how he had been there as a representative, and they had blatantly just kind of denied it.
Right.
But the hope in all of this is, even though he touched them where it hurt, he offered some remedy to it. He offered grace in the middle of it by saying, you've done all these things, but I can still give you rest if you come to me. We can still turn things around. So it was like he was addressing the problem. Just it kind of reminded me of Revelations when they were talking about the different churches.
Right.
He says, I know your works, I know these things, and that you need a hot nor cold, but, we can still work with that. We can still change that. You can still be saved. I stand at the door and I knock. And if anyone who answers it, I will come in. So it's like the same type of invitation for those people as well.
Piggybacking on that, what we must realize that coming to Jesus is not a natural thing. That's why Jesus bids people, gives them the welcome to come to me, right? This is what I'm going to do. I'm give you some direction or some opportunity or some choices. Not choices, but give you this choice so that you can come to me. Because I know, you're not thinking of me, but here's the opportunity that you can come. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, and then we see that at the beginning, within 11, that Jesus had already let them know that the Father had chosen him. He said that even so the Father, all things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son will be revealed to him. So he had given background where he comes from, and so, then he gave the invitation for them to come.
Okay. Going on, the second part of that phrase, that statement is, I will give you rest. What kind of rest is Jesus talking about?
Rest from circumstances.
Okay. Any other kind of rest?
Mental rest, spiritual rest, physical rest, it's all kind of different rest. All included in it.
Tied into that rest, it has also to do with the burden bearing that we have, right? Because it said, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest." The rest is from all the burdens of sin, also the burden related to the law. That's the kind of rest that Jesus wanted to give his people. The question on this is, all right. They wanted us to look at ourselves under Sunday's lesson in Acts. The question is asked, what kind of burden are you carrying, right? Meaning, have you given your burden to Jesus, right? So that have you encountered that rest? Most of us want to believe that we've encountered that rest. We've given our burdens to Jesus. But circling back to when we first started is that truly that we've given our burden to Jesus, or are we still carrying the burden ourselves? Yes, ma'am?
I remember a long time going to church, the they try to continue, I guess they got a habit of having to deal with things on their own, so they brought the burden back and said, back down with it, and said it was useless. Just like the illustration we used earlier, we have to give it all, surrender it all to him in order for him to help us and give us that rest.
Okay. All right. So those of you who are following, on Monday, we come to take my yoke upon you. This will make the backdrop for most of the rest of the lesson. It says, why does Jesus command us to take his yoke right after he has invited us to join? Right after he has invited us to give him our burden and to find true rest. The question is, what does it mean to take his yoke on you? Any takers? Anybody?
We can't do it ourselves, we need a helper, so we have to surrender it all to him, to follow him, and then to be able to learn from him.
All right. Okay. I guess the question is, what we should first define is, what is a yoke? That's what we should first define, you know.
Like the ox that you carry, that you put on your strap on, and then you got the person that's running the ox. That's what a yoke is.
Okay.
That combines two people together. It's like a relationship.
All right. What was the purpose of the yoke? Yes. Okay. All right. In that sense, why would Jesus say, take my yoke upon you? What does he want us to do? He wants to bind us to him, right? So that we can work together to fulfill his purpose. Earlier on in the passage in Matthew 11:25-27, Jesus had said that, he and the Father work together. Their main purpose is to save humanity, and by asking us to take the yoke with him, what he wants us to do is to help, in the process of saving humanity. What we should be real careful to realize is that Jesus did not say carry the burden yourself, right? He says, join with me, right? And what he says is, once you join with me, the burden becomes lighter, because it's no longer you that's doing it yourself. It's me. I'm the one who's doing the heavy lifting, right? That's what he's trying to tell us. And what we also find on the Monday's lesson is when they talk about the yoke, it had different meanings to the people, to the Jewish people. In one context, the yoke was a common metaphor for the law, right? And then we see when Paul was talking about the yoke in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, what he was talking about, the yoke of bondage having to do with circumcision, right? Did you guys get that from the lesson? What Jesus was asking us when he asked us to take up the yoke is to become his ambassador and to share the good news with those around us. All right? When we yoke up with Jesus, what happens to us is what? Our hearts become changed, right? And our motives becomes transformed. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, I think what helped me to look at the lesson was look at this as being a progressional step.
Right.
So Sunday's lesson says, okay, I need to prepare
Cool.
myself to connect with Christ. And that is recognizing how much I need a Savior, how much, that my burdens are heavy, and that I need Him, and then He has the invitation of me to come to Him. And now He's saying, okay, now that you've come, we're going to share the load. You give it to me, and I'm going to give you mine, because mine is easier to carry. So by surrenderance to the Lord and surrendering obedience, I now want what He wants. So we're connected in will. And so, like you were saying in Galatians, they were placing upon them the rules and regulations of things to follow that they themselves were having trouble following, and it was kind of discouraging to the people to try to maintain the level of what was expected of them by the leaders. And Jesus came in and kind of turned all that upside down, and He was saying, you do not have to carry this alone. Let's yoke together. Let's combine forces, and you can do, I will give you the power to do what you need to do, where you're not doing it in your own strength.
Okay.
And you can be victorious.
Yeah. Any other comments from that lesson? There was one thing that was brought out in the teacher section of the lesson regarding the yoke. What it talked about is when animals were yoked together, what they had to do, they had to fit the animal to be able to bear the yoke, right? Since it was a solid piece of wood, what they had to do, they had to measure the animal, right? And then they would cut out the part that would fit each animal, and then they would bring back the animal, right? Put the yoke over it, see if they needed to make any adjustments or not, right? Once the yoke was well suited to the animal or well fitted to the animal, then and only then would the animals be yoked together. What they want to show on this lesson is that when we yoke up with Jesus, Jesus knows our circumstances, and He knows how to fit everything directly towards each person, right? That's why He could go on and say, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, because the stuff is fitted towards you. No matter what type of temptation or anything like that you've got, you remember, Jesus is the one who's going to be bearing it for you. They come to you in a way that, he already knows what you can handle and what you cannot handle. Yes, ma'am?
What I appreciated about that is that when we learn from Jesus, we truly learn obedience and commitment. And that helps us to bring on the characteristic of His disciples.
All right. The other thing about the yoke is a symbol of submission, right? You got to submit to Jesus in order to be able to bear His yoke. You can't be going in your own direction. You got to submit to Him, and He, as we know, will direct our paths. Also, the lesson was on Monday. The second part of that was for us to learn about Jesus. It says, learn of me, right? Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. Let's deal with what does learn of me implies.
Being educated.
Pardon me?
Being educated by God, you have to,
That is correct. All right. It goes a little bit deeper than being educated by God. I mean, I should not say that. There's some more in addition to being educated by God, or being more explicit when you say being educated by God. What they said is being learned of God is to be His disciple, not only his disciple in name only, but showing characteristics of a disciple, which are what? Obedience and commitment, right? Once you learn of him, you do what he asks you to do. He asks you to go out and tell people about him, and to work with him in saving souls, right? The lesson on Mondays asks, in the middle of the lesson, they ask, what is the difference between being heavy laden and taking up Christ's yoke? Yes, ma'am.
Being heavy laden is carrying your own burdens instead of, and then taking up his yoke means that we surrender it all to Jesus through obedience and commitment.
Okay. Let me ask you, I'm thinking about, in what way do we carry our own burdens?
When we don't go to God in prayer on decisions we have to make, we're doing it on our own instead of trusting God to lead us.
Okay. Okay. Do we find ourselves doing that every day? Where we kind of lean to our own wisdom and not really trusting in God? All right, any questions or comments before we move on?
I know for me it was hard when I first began practicing to be a servant of God. For me to take orders, it was hard for me because I always had to do it myself. But when I learned to give it to God, that weight of responsibility got light for me because I wasn't by myself. I had him working with me hand in hand, so that relationship developed stronger and stronger in the truth.
Okay. Let's go ahead and read the verse again. It says, all of you take up your yoke and learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest to your souls. That being said, let's move on to Tuesday's lesson, which talks about I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus says to us, take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in heart. All right? What does it mean to be gentle and lowly in heart? What does that mean?
To be humble. To be humble. That's being gentle.
Okay.
And meek.
The lesson ties that to being meek.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you understand when you say somebody's meek? How do you understand that?
Well, when I think about Christ and who he was a servant, and everything he did was for the benefit of others, so that God may receive the glory of it. And he didn't do it for them to worship him or to claim glory for it, because in the eyes of the priest, it was considered blasphemy to forgive sins, even though he was a part of the Godhead. So Christ was meek in the fact that he didn't go around to be Christ's superstar to everybody. He came that they may know who the Father was. So he, in essence, faded into the background and highlighted the Father. Whereas the Father, no, it's about my Son who has come to help us to know who the Father is. And so by us taking on the character of Christ, we fade into the background to put God forward and to point people to him so they may be saved also. And that was the whole goal of Christ's mission here on earth.
Okay. And looking at this lesson, the first thing it says, gentleness is an underrated quality of humanity today. Humility is laughed at. It says, meekness and humility are not descriptions of pushovers, right? Of people who cannot stand their own ground. A lot of times we'll see people who, they're meek and stuff like that, and they find themselves not wanting to deal with confrontation, right? They'll do whatever they can to avoid confrontation. The lesson was clear to say that, Jesus avoided confrontation, right? That was the first thing and the first part of the lesson that it says, Jesus avoided confrontation. But when confrontation came to him,
He didn't run.
He was
He rose
forceful
to the occasion.
in answering the confrontation, right? I mean, he wasn't disrespectful or anything like that. A lot of times, when you look at the way how Jesus answered confrontation, a lot of people were taken off guard because he didn't answer it the way how they expected him to answer it, right?
He normally turned it around on them and
Right.
asked them, when we think about the woman who they had brought to Jesus to condemned because of the act they claimed they caught her in. They were looking for him to straight up condemn her, but yet they found themselves in the hot seat. So it was like, even though Christ didn't go around trolling for a fight, when the fight came to him, he was very good at knowing how to handle that.
All right, good. On Friday's lesson, they were talking about humility and lowliness in heart. And they asked, is humility and lowliness of heart bad for somebody's self-esteem? How do you reconcile that? Is it bad for a person's self-esteem to be humble and meek when, most of the times we kind of think that the people who are most successful, the people who are most brazen and, in your face type people, the people who make changes are those people who are willing to stand up and, be real forceful and speak out and stuff like that, versus what we expect of a meek and humble person, somebody who doesn't really, I guess I should say, the general conception of a humble and meek person is a person who does not seek out confrontation or anything like that, right? That's a question to ponder. Is it good for self-esteem, or is it bad for self-esteem for somebody to be humble and meek?
I guess it just depends on the aspect of how we're looking at it.
One more time?
I said, I guess it just depends on the aspect of how we're looking at it. I don't know if that's a cut and dry answer. If we're looking at it as Christians being, followers of Christ, does that mean if we're humble and meek, that we're pushovers? I guess I'm asking the question. So does that mean that if we are taking on that characteristic by the world's standards, are we supposed to be pushovers? Because a humble and a meek person can be successful. It's because of their meekness and willingness to maybe listen to their employees and take good, smart investments and, not be a know-it-all, that they are successful. So I guess I'm just asking, what is the standard that we're looking at as far as being humble and meek? Is it heavenly standards or is it earthly standards?
Yes, ma'am?
I like to be humble and meek for a simple reason. You're able to be taught when you're humble. You learn more. So that's a good standard to have.
Yep. I mean, when you think about humble and meek people, a lot of times, even though they might not be the first go-to person, they're always the person that's reliable. You understand? They're the person that if you ask them something, you're going to get the correct answer, even if you don't like the answer that you get. There's going to be an answer that will stand the test of time. Yes, Henry?
I was going to say, when I look at it, is that I look at how Jesus handled it. Where Jesus is humble and meek, that's how we should be. Regardless of how the world look at it, or how the world thinks, I'm not trying to live like the world. I'm trying to live like Jesus. And if I put him first, I'm not going to fail. So see, if we just watch, read, and watch how Jesus handled things, and if we handle it the same way as he did, we're going to be all right with Jesus. And that's, to me, that's the most important person I want to impress.
Okay. On the Tuesday, there's a statement by Ellen White from Christ's Object Lesson, which is really important, which is very important. It says, a knowledge of the truth depends not so much upon strength of intellect as upon pureness of purpose, the simplicity of an earnest, dependent faith. To those who in humility of heart seek for divine guidance, angels of God draw near. The Holy Spirit is given to open to them the rich treasures of truth. That's a very important statement there. You know, it's not so much about how intelligent you are or anything like that. It's, you know, how much you seek God, where God can change you and provide, you know, the understanding of the scriptures to you. Tuesday's lesson compares Jesus' humility with that of Moses, you know. And the lesson first started out with Moses' meekness, you know. And what it talked about is I think I might be getting ahead of myself here. Okay. The lesson compares Jesus' meekness to that of Moses. What it showed is, in comparing Jesus, the first way they compare Jesus and Moses is that, you know, Moses gave his sermon from Sinai, whereas Jesus gave his sermon from the Mount of Olives, talking about with the Beatitudes. The second way that we see that Jesus and Moses are compared is, you know, Moses feeding the whole congregation with manna, whereas we also see Jesus being able to feed whole congregations, 5,000 people or so, with food in relation to miracles. The third way they compare Jesus to Moses is that Moses asked to be made a sacrifice for the people. He was telling God what to blot me out. Don't blot out these people, but blot me out. Whereas Jesus became the actual substitute. What they try to show is that Moses was not the person who would make the best substitute or intercessor. With Jesus, you see, Jesus could do that because Jesus was without sin. The final thing that they say is that, you know, Jesus being our intercessor and substitute would be all for nothing unless the cross and resurrection was involved in it. You know, that's something that we need to kind of dwell on, you know, because of the cross and Christ's resurrection. That's how he became not only our intercessor, but our substitute. Questions? Okay. On Wednesday, we're talking about, we look again at the yoke. It says, for my yoke is easy. What does that talk about here when it says my yoke is easy? What is Jesus talking about? When it says his yoke is easy. What he was talking about is the way how the law was being translated, right? How much nitpickiness was placed on the law. Let's put it that way. You know, there was a whole lot of different things that you had to do to be able to, I guess, for lack of a better term, to be able to abide by the law, or to be able to live out the law. What Jesus was saying, you know, here is being with me, you know, I will, you know, you're going to have a different understanding of the law than you actually now understand. This is more about transformation of your heart, character. You know, while the law is important, it's not so much the letter of the law, but you know, it's how it should be interpreted so that it can be lived out correctly. It says, when they talk about the law being easy in Matthew 11, verse 30, you know, it says they were talking about the law being, they were talking about it being good, pleasant, useful, and benevolent. It goes on to say, many people around us consider God's law heavy-handed, difficult to comply with, and at times irrelevant. How can you help them to discover the beauty of the law and inspire love for the lawgiver? What can you do? Yes, ma'am?
For me, by obeying the law, then I'm showing that although it's not easy sometimes, it's the best way to go. You know, it's like Peter said, where else can I go? You have saying to everlasting life. So it's the best way to go.
All right. Let's hear from some people who didn't say anything as yet. I'm going to start calling on people.
Yeah, do that.
I'll start calling on people. All right. Question that's on the floor is, how can you help people to discover the beauty of the law and inspire love for the lawgiver? I mean, that's part of why we're here, right? You know, to be able to, because we love the law, we love the lawgiver. How can we help other people to be able to come to the understanding to love God and to love the law? How can we do that? Yes, ma'am.
When I think of
Let's get the mics.
following the law and obeying the law, it's always difficult and it's always rigorous. But when you think of a relationship, just like on our earthly relationships, when you fall in love with somebody, you don't think of what you're doing for them or what they're asking you to do for them as a burden.
Right.
So the first thing, and I remember telling my children now that they're grown, that don't think of the church and what the church does and what this person is doing and why you don't want to go to this church or the other. But think of the person, the reason why we're going to church. There's a person behind the church. And fall in love with that person. Get to know him.
Right.
Why
All right.
The good thing about it, he helps you to do it.
Okay.
So that's why he invites us to take, uses the word yoke because that's what the Israelites were doing. It was really a burden. But he tells us, take mine. When you take it, I'm feeling you. I'll walk with you, I'll show you, and it's easy.
Okay. Any other ways? Any other ways? Anybody else? I mean, this is the crux of evangelism, right? To be able to help people to love the law, right? And to love the law and to love the lawgiver.
To live
Right?
as an example of what the law is.
Okay.
So Christ, he was the living example, and he kept the law, and I think through his example, people were attracted to him. They saw the loving and the kindness that he displayed. They saw things in him that represented the law, which drew them to him. And so I think when we are living in God's will, it will draw people to us, but to him. And because our lives reflect, and we use the word law, but the commandments is really the mirror. It
Right.
shows us where the dirt is, what the problem in our lives are. And like my sister said, when we fall in love with Christ, we want to clean those things up so that we are a representation of who he is, so others might see him through our lives. So the whole basis is to be that living example that people can see what Christ has done in our lives and want that too.
Right. All right. The lesson goes on to talk about, yes, Master?
The other thing about the law that you could share with people is when you follow the law, you don't have a lot of stress. You obey God's will, it takes off a lot of stress off you. It just makes life more go freely. And when you're faced with these stress, you tend to fall back to the man that give you the law and asking question people. So the most thing I will tell someone, when you follow the law, it takes off a lot of stress.
Yeah. One thing the lesson brings out is that as we grow in faith and such, we will fall. They use the example of a child learning to walk. The child takes the first step, it falls, what? It gets up again, may take a few more steps, and then it falls. But, the knowledge, the experience of being able to move kind of pushes the child to say, no, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this as well as I can until, they're able to walk comfortably without any help or anything like that. What it is saying to us, walking in Jesus is not always easy, right? It's great and good to do the right thing. At times we will stumble or even fall, but yet we get up and keep going and continue to walk knowing that Jesus is on our side. I mean, that's the main thing that you need to understand. Jesus is always there. We're yoked with him, and because we're yoked with him, he takes the burden and he carries the majority of the burden. Our work is to be united with him, as the burden bearer. We go on to Thursdays. It says, "My burden is light." I had said I kind of got ahead of myself, but this